There are days when life gives no warning, yet cruelly strips everything from you: your job, your money, your faith, even the fragile belief that tomorrow might be better. Those are the days when adults are forced to stand tall, even as their hearts are falling to the very bottom. And it is often in those moments when despair feels absolute that something small, a sentence, a glance, or even a single hamburger can become the reason a person decides to rise, to keep moving, and to change the course of their life entirely. This is the story of Daniel, a single father who had exactly $12 left in his wallet on his son's birthday, a man who had lost nearly everything, yet still tried to keep a smile on his face for the child who believed in him more than anyone else in the world. As dusk settled and the city lights flickered on, crowds hurried past while Daniel stood alone in front of the old fast food shop at the corner. In his hand was a wrinkled bill, softened by years. In his eyes was a worry he could no longer hide. He took a deep breath, wondering if there was anything more he could do besides pretending everything was fine. Ethan's birthday, his 7-year-old son, was supposed to be a joyful day. Yet today, all Daniel could bring home was the cheapest hamburger on the menu, a birthday dinner he knew he couldn't make any better. He looked at the bill one last time before stepping inside, feeling the cold neon light wash over his tired face. In that moment, Daniel had no idea that this small decision, buying the last hamburger with the little money he had left, would lead him into the hardest yet most beautiful journey of his life. A journey that began in despair, but would end with something he had never dared to dream of, and all of it would start with a single hamburger shared in half. After Ethan had fallen asleep, Daniel remained seated in the dark, watching the faint yellow bulb flicker against the cracked wall. The small room was nearly empty, holding only a few worn-out belongings, remnants of everything they had sold piece by piece just to survive. He glanced around the house, and guilt wrapped tightly around his chest. There are things a father never wants his child to witness: poverty, helplessness, or the fear that comes from a harsh and unrelenting reality. But Ethan, though little, had seen too much already. He knew his father was tired. He knew his father was sad. And that more than anything made Daniel feel he had to keep going, even when every part of him wanted to collapse. The next morning, Daniel left the house at dawn. The sun hadn't risen yet, and the streets were still silent. He walked quickly to save the last drops of gas left in his car. The morning chill pierced through his skin, but it wasn't as cold as the fear inside him, the fear that today would be just like yesterday, that every door would remain closed, mocking his efforts. Still, Daniel walked. Every step was a reminder that he had no other choice. The morning passed with dozens of rejections. Everywhere he went, people skimmed his resume with a look that was part pity, part doubt. "We need someone younger. Someone with more relevant skills. We're cutting staff at the moment." Daniel kept smiling politely as he left each place, but behind every smile was a cut that made him feel smaller and smaller, like the world around him was expanding, while he, somehow, was shrinking, disappearing into a space where he no longer belonged. By noon, Daniel sat on a park bench, opened his nearly empty water bottle, and took a small sip, trying to stay composed. In front of him were families laughing, kids running, parents chatting cheerfully. Daniel watched them and wondered, do they know how lucky they are? A part of him wanted to give up, to stop fighting, to accept that life had chosen him for endless hardship. But then he pulled out Ethan's, drawing from his jacket pocket the messy, childlike letters full of love. Every time he looked at it, Daniel felt strength return to his legs. That afternoon, he continued searching. He stopped by a large construction site. Machines rumbled loudly, dust filled the air. When he asked the manager if they needed extra help, the man looked him over from his hands to his age, then shook his head. "This job takes a lot of physical strength. I'm afraid you won't manage." Daniel didn't argue. He nodded, thanked him, and walked away. But each comment like that was a sharp blade carving into his pride. By the time the sun began to set, painting the buildings in a warm shade of orange, Daniel found himself in front of a small corner diner. He didn't know why he stepped inside. Maybe the smell of grilled meat reminded him of better days. Or maybe something in his heart whispered that this might be his last chance. The owner, a salt-and-pepper-haired man with sharp eyes, examined him from head to toe. Daniel handed over his resume, his voice rough from hours of walking and talking. "I'm looking for a job. Any job." The owner flipped through the papers for a few seconds and then set them down. "Ever worked in a kitchen?" Daniel swallowed hard and shook his head. "No. But I can learn." I need this job. The owner crossed his arms. I need someone with experience, not someone I have to train. A heavy silence followed. Daniel felt the last of his hope slipping away like sand through his fingers. Just as the owner turned to leave, Daniel spoke again, his voice trembling but firm. Then let me work for free. I'll wash dishes, clean floors, scrub, anything. Just let me stay near the kitchen. The owner stared at him for a long time, so long that Daniel began to feel foolish for even saying it. But then the man sighed and nodded. Fine. Come in tomorrow. The next day, Daniel started his dishwashing shift. It was harder than he imagined. The hot water burned his hands, the smell of grease clung to him no matter how hard he scrubbed. He stood for hours, his back screaming in pain. But Daniel didn't complain. While scrubbing dishes, he constantly watched the main kitchen, the way they seasoned the meat, the way they flipped patties with precise timing, the rhythm of their movements. Every detail became a lesson. Every night, Daniel was always the last one to leave. When the diner closed, he would ask the owner for permission to use some discarded ingredients to practice small scraps of meat, slightly stale buns, wilted lettuce. He practiced the same motions dozens of times. Sometimes he burned the patty until it was pitch black. Sometimes he dropped the whole burger on the floor. He felt disappointed, but he never quit. Every failure reminded him of Ethan, of the hamburger they split in half, and of the word hero. One stormy evening, Daniel was still in the kitchen practicing. His work shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands trembling from exhaustion and from a small fresh burn swelling on his skin. The owner walked in, standing silently behind him, though Daniel didn't even notice. He watched every movement Daniel made, the care, the persistence, the effort so intense that time seemed to disappear around him. When Daniel finally turned around and jumped slightly at the sight of the owner, he immediately apologized. But the man only asked, "How long have you been practicing like this?" Daniel lowered his gaze. "A few weeks. I just want to do better." The owner was quiet for several seconds before saying a sentence that nearly brought Daniel to tears. "Tomorrow, you're going into the main kitchen." From that moment on, Daniel's life veered in a completely new direction. He was taught proper cooking techniques, how to use seasoning more delicately, how to present dishes beautifully. He learned so quickly that even the head chef was surprised. And the dish Daniel devoted himself to the most was the special hamburger, the one he created from the memory of the brown paper-wrapped burger he bought that birthday night. He wanted the dish to carry not just flavor, but emotion. Gradually, customers began coming not only to eat, but specifically to try Daniel's burger. They said his food had something very real in it, something they couldn't quite name, but could feel. Daniel knew exactly what that ingredient was, something only those who have survived their darkest despair truly understand. Hope. A small but stubborn hope. Life began to change. Daniel saved every dollar, cutting out all unnecessary expenses. He and Ethan started having evening walks, better dinners, more laughter. Ethan grew up proudly, telling his friends that his dad was the best chef in the world. Whenever he heard that, Daniel only smiled. Because if anyone was the hero in this story, he knew it was Ethan. And then one day, when Daniel finally felt he had enough experience and enough savings, he decided to pursue the biggest dream of his life, opening a small food truck. He spent weeks fixing up the old vehicle, painting over every dent, hanging small lights along its edges, and placing on the side the words he had carried in his heart for years: Hero Burger. When Ethan asked why he chose that name, Daniel simply replied with a warm smile, "Because you helped me stand back up." On opening day, a long line of people waited to try Daniel's hamburger, but even more important than that, Ethan stood beside his father holding the scissors for the ribbon cutting, his eyes full of pride as if he were looking at a true superhero. In that moment, Daniel realized that the long journey filled with tears, persistence, pain, and hope had led them to a new life, one he once believed he would never reach. In the days after becoming a main chef, Daniel's life continued shifting in small but unmistakable ways. He no longer worried about affording daily meals, but a new pressure emerged keeping up in the kitchen, which demanded speed, precision, and calm under fire. Daniel learned to coordinate with coworkers, to work fast without mistakes, to stay focused even when the restaurant fell into chaos during peak hours. At first, it overwhelmed him. He had never worked in such a fast-paced environment before. There were nights when he stood in the kitchen, sweat dripping down his forehead, hands shaking after he burned 2 patties in a row. Coworkers looked at him with little sympathy. and Daniel felt as though he was being pushed back to square one. One night, as he was about to leave after closing, Daniel overheard two chefs talking. One said, "I don't know why the boss put him in the kitchen. No experience, older than the rest of us. He might ruin the whole place." Daniel heard every word, but he didn't walk in to defend himself. He just stood by the door, hand gripping the handle tightly, chest heavy. Those kinds of comments were nothing new. His whole life, he had heard variations of the same thing, that he wasn't good enough, fast enough, smart enough, young enough. But this time, he understood something. If he let those voices defeat him, then all his sacrifices would mean nothing. So Daniel gently released the doorknob, turned back into the kitchen, and practiced for another hour in silence. These were the moments that push the story into its third emotional peak, when viewers feel the protagonist is about to break, but instead he rises at the exact moment it matters most. The challenges didn't only come from the kitchen. They also came from home. One evening, when Daniel returned later than usual, he found Ethan sitting on the couch with teary eyes. Daniel rushed to him, pulling him into an embrace. "What's wrong, buddy?" Ethan hesitated, then handed him a paper from school notice of a field trip fee. A cost Daniel wasn't sure he could manage immediately. The boy whispered, "Dad, it's okay if I don't go. I know we don't have much." Daniel felt his heart tighten. He stroked Ethan's hair and said, "No, Ethan, you deserve everything the other kids have. Let me take care of it." But after Ethan went to bed, Daniel sat down, lifted a hand to cover his face, and took a long, shaky breath. He knew he would have to work extra hours to afford it. Every day seemed to demand more from him than he had to give, but still, Daniel chose to keep moving. Those months were a stretch of relentless effort. Daniel worked harder, learned faster, saved more strictly. He cut everything he could cut. No new clothes, no eating out, not a single dollar spent on himself. Every bit of money went to Ethan, and to paying off old debts. There were nights he slept only a few hours, his body so sore he could barely move in the morning. But every time he saw Ethan sleeping peacefully, he knew stopping was not an option. One day, an incident in the kitchen made Daniel feel as though he was about to lose everything all over again. The restaurant was packed. Orders rushed in non-stop. Voices calling out dishes mixed with the clatter of pans, pure chaos. Daniel was preparing his special hamburger when he suddenly dropped an entire tray of meat onto the floor. The loud crash made everyone in the kitchen turn around. A few shook their heads, some let out sighs. Daniel froze. His whole body stiffened as if crushed under the weight of everyone's stares. The head chef walked over, looked at Daniel for a long moment, then simply said, "Mistakes happen. Clean it up. Start again." Daniel almost couldn't believe his ears. He looked at the chef with grateful eyes, bowed slightly, and continued working. At that moment, Daniel understood that he had begun to be accepted not through words, but through a quiet, unspoken trust. Seasons passed. With each one, Daniel grew a little more. The hero burger he created didn't just become the best-selling item of the diner, it became the symbol of his own life story. Customers started asking for his name, asking to take photos with him. Some local newspapers even published a story about the cook who overcame adversity to become the rising star of a small neighborhood diner. Daniel read that article with trembling hands, unable to believe it was about him. He thought of the day he stood outside that fast food shop with only $12, and it felt like he had lived an entirely different lifetime since then. The more successful he became, the more Daniel understood that it was finally time to do what he had always dreamed of, owning a place truly his own. Not a big restaurant, not a fancy dining hall, just a small food truck where he could serve his hero burger and tell his story through every bite. He spent months researching, applying for permits, and repairing the old truck a friend had sold him for cheap. Ethan helped him draw the logo, choose the paint colors, and even suggested naming the truck Hero Burger, something that touched Daniel so deeply he couldn't speak for several seconds. The grand opening day was strangely beautiful. Soft sunlight shone on the freshly painted truck, making the words Hero Burger stand out on the small street. Loyal customers from the diner came to support him, along with strangers who had heard the story of the father who once had only $12 left. Ethan stood beside him holding the scissors, his face glowing with pride. When the boy cut the ribbon, the sound of applause rose, an applause Daniel had waited his entire life to hear. He looked at his son, eyes filled with emotion. Ethan looked up and asked, "Dad, are you proud?" Daniel knelt down. hugged him tightly, and said, "I'm proud because of you. You gave me strength when I had none." The applause, the customers calling out orders, the sizzling sound of meat, it all blended into the symphony of a new life. Daniel stood inside his little truck, flipping patties and assembling burgers, but his heart felt lighter than ever. He wasn't rich, he wasn't famous, he hadn't achieved massive success, but he had done the most important thing. He kept his promise to his son that he would never give up. In that moment, Daniel understood that his journey wasn't truly about a shared hamburger or the last few dollars in his wallet. It was a story about love, perseverance, and faith, a story proving that no matter how far life pushes someone down, as long as there is at least one person who believes in you, you will always have a reason to rise again. When their first day of business ended, the sunset slowly fell behind the tall buildings, painting the street in a gentle orange glow. The Hero Burger truck stood quietly in the small, open lot as Daniel and Ethan cleaned up together. The smell of grilled meat, warm buns, and crispy onions lingered in the air, like a reminder that today had been a good day, a day worth remembering, a day Daniel would carry in his heart forever. Ethan sat on the step, swinging his small legs while gazing at the darkening sky. Daniel stood by the truck, watching his son with an indescribably tender look. All the exhaustion, all the pressure, all the painful memories of the past years suddenly felt distant. Daniel walked over and sat beside Ethan. The two of them stayed silent for a few seconds, as if savoring a rare, peaceful moment gifted by life. Ethan turned to him and asked, "Dad, do you remember the hamburger we shared, the one on my birthday?" Daniel smiled and nodded. "Of course I do. That was the most important hamburger of my life." Ethan tilted his head. "Why?" Daniel met his eyes, his voice low and steady, as if speaking straight from his soul. "Because that was the day I realized I couldn't give up. Even when I had nothing, I still had you. And having you means I have everything." The boy smiled and leaned his head on his father's shoulder. Daniel wrapped an arm around him, feeling the small warmth seep into his body, melting away all the coldness that had clung to him through the darkest days of his life. A gentle breeze passed by, carrying their laughter into the distant hum of city traffic and the soft sounds of the evening. Daniel closed his eyes, and suddenly, the old version of himself appeared in his mind, the man standing outside a fast food shop with $12, the man sitting hopelessly in a dark room staring at an empty wallet, the man who believed life had abandoned him. Then he opened his eyes and saw the present, his own Hero Burger truck, his smiling son beside him, and a future far bigger than anything he once imagined. No one in life ever knows how many times they will fall, how many times they will lose everything, how many times they will stand at a crossroads with only two choices to give up or continue. But Daniel chose to rise, not because he was stronger than others, but because he had a reason worth fighting for, a reason named Ethan. As father and son closed the truck for the night, Daniel took one last look at the glowing letters Hero Burger under the streetlight. He gently touched the word hero, and in that moment, he no longer thought of himself. Because he understood that the greatest hero in his life wasn't the man in the newspaper or the chef praised by customers, it was the little boy who once wrote on a wrinkled sheet of paper, "Dad, you're my hero." That night, on the quiet little street under a sky fading into deep indigo, Daniel held Ethan's hand tightly and whispered softly into the wind, "Thank you for saving me when I didn't know how to save myself." And their story does not end here. It only begins from a hamburger split in half on the worst day of their lives, to the Hero Burgers now carrying hope to hundreds of others. A journey proving that sometimes the smallest thing can change an entire life. All it takes is one person who believes in you, and the courage to believe in yourself again.